Following President Trump's repeated threats about annexing Greenland to the United States, the European powers dispatched a military contingent to Greenlandic territory with the aim of sending a clear message of unity to the White House. Trump immediately responded by announcing tariffs on the countries involved in the move and by threatening the use of direct military force, both against Greenland and against Europe. The Third World War could begin within NATO, between the United States and Europe. The world is upside down. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning from Berlin, Germany. We're starting broadcast number 323 of Demolishing Myths Talks, completely live. Thank you very much for joining us, and remember to help us out with a thumbs up against censorship, as well as through our social media, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. And don't forget to join us on our newly created Demolishing Myths channel on Patreon. On the other side of the screen, and surely fearful of the start of a great war between the United States and Europe, imminent due to Greenland, Mr. Fernando Moragón. Fernando, what a terrible situation.
Fernando, qué situación terrible. Terrible, terrible. Yo no logro con decirte que no he dormido hoy.
Terrible. Terrible. Just to tell you I haven't slept today should give you an idea. Look, this isn't a coincidence. This t-shirt, kind of military style, is because I'm waiting to be called up at any moment. I mean, I'm ready because the defense of Greenland is going to require a titanic effort from the European Union. Anyway, but well, I'm telling you, in this situation, forget it, demolishers. Forget those silly ideas about kidnapping Maduro and stirring up trouble in Venezuela. That's nothing. The wars in the Middle East, whether they're going to attack Iran or start some color revolution, that's going nowhere. I mean, that's absolutely nothing. That business with the Chinese villages out there in the Pacific, with Taiwan, whatever, the South China Sea. Come on, this is what matters. This is where the history of humanity is decided.
Esto es lo importante. Aquí se decide la historia de la humanidad. Aquí, Fernando, de hecho, imágenes recibidas.
Here, Fernando, in fact, recently received historic footage of the landing shown by Greenlandic television, a massive landing that somewhat recalls D-Day, exactly the same, but with snow. European soldiers, a truly large contingent. 15 French soldiers, 13 Germans, 3 from Sweden, 2 from Norway, 1 from the United Kingdom, 1 from the Netherlands, 2 from Finland, and 2 from Slovenia. With a unanimous battle cry, "They shall not pass, victory forever."
Until victory always, they shall not pass.
This is the situation, though, on the Greenland front. Just as those soldiers were landing there, Trump, at a press conference, was sharing this anecdote.
No, we will not do that.
No, we won't do it.
I said no.
I called each of the European leaders, reminding them what happened with the tariff measures a few months ago. Right?
And I just went one after another. I called Germany.
I called each one. I called the Germans, and they told me, no, we're not going to do anything.
I said, no, we're going to put a 25% tariff, which is, by the way, about...
We're going to impose a 25% sanction, Trump recalled in this anecdote.
The Germans told me, no, we're not going to do anything. It's just fine.
Like 7 times. This wasn't like a little bit more. 7 times more. And I may do that for Greenland too.
And I called the tariffs. And I could do that for Greenland too. If they don't go along with us on Greenland, we're going to impose tariffs on them, just like we did in the past. Of course, I can do that anytime. Sure, he still didn't seem aware of the situation, since he was taking part in that conference. Once he left, he was informed about the massive arrival of those soldiers.
From the offensive, the European offensive.
The nation under attack immediately responded with this. With the threat of tariffs gone, here's their post on the social network Truth. Let's set it up here. Now then, this is the text. We have subsidized Denmark, all the countries of the European Union and others for many years, refraining from charging them tariffs or any other form of compensation. Now, after centuries, it's time for Denmark to give back. World peace is at stake. China and Russia want Greenland, and Denmark can't do anything about it. They currently have 2 dog sleds as protection. One of them, he recently added, only the United States, under the presidency of Donald J. Trump, can take part in this game, and with great success.
Puede participar en este juego y con mucho éxito. Nadie tocará este territorio sagrado.
No one will touch this sacred territory, especially because the national security of the United States and the entire world is at stake. Moreover, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and Finland have traveled to Greenland for unknown purposes. This is a very dangerous situation for the security and survival of our planet. These countries involved in this game have put things at an unsustainable level of risk. Therefore, it is imperative that in order to protect global peace and security, strong measures be taken so that this potentially dangerous situation ends quickly and without a doubt. Starting on February 1st, all the aforementioned countries, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and Finland, will have to pay a 10% tariff on all goods shipped to the United States of America. On June 1st, 2026, the tariff will increase to 25%. This tariff will remain in effect and payable until an agreement is reached for the full purchase of Greenland. The United States has been trying to make this transaction for more than 150 years. Many presidents have tried, and rightly so, but Denmark has always refused. Now, because of the Golden Dome and the modern weapon systems, both offensive and defensive, the need to acquire it is especially important. Thank you. Well, an even longer tirade. Thank you for your attention. Donald J. Trump. Tariffs on countries at war, dear Fernando.
Tremendo. Es decir, ya digo.
Well, tremendous. I mean, as I said, the situation is critical. Nobody knows whether the Europeans are going to launch missiles against the United States or not. But anyway, what missiles? Right, well, let's see. But we've got some medieval catapults in a few museums that still work perfectly today. Well, let's see. All of this depends on how you look at things. Because if we look at it from a different point of view, it says there are 2 dog sleds. The last one was just added. But if we say, for example, European forces have doubled the number of sleds in Greenland, it sounds much better here.
And yes, doubling Greenland's military capacity.
Sure. Well, I mean, and sleds are really useful because in these snowy places and all that, walking just isn't really possible.
Fortunately, Fernando, the patriots, and, above all, the European patriots, are already responding with foam at the mouth, spewing bile in warmongering fury to immediately begin a confrontation against the American despot. Here are Ursula von der Leyen's statements on her X page. Territorial integrity and sovereignty are fundamental principles of international law. They are essential for Europe and for the international community as a whole. We have consistently emphasized our shared transatlantic interest in peace and security in the Arctic, including through NATO. The Danish military exercise, previously coordinated and carried out with allies, responds to the need to strengthen security in the Arctic and does not represent any threat to anyone. The European Union fully stands in solidarity with Denmark and the people of Greenland. Dialogue remains essential, and we are committed to continuing the process initiated last week between the Kingdom of Denmark and the United States. Tariffs would undermine transatlantic relations and trigger a dangerous downward spiral. Europe will remain united, coordinated, and committed to defending its sovereignty. Based on this statement, Fernando, we cannot determine who actually made the threat, because it doesn't even show the minimal courage to explicitly mention the United States. and its threats against Greenland and the imposition of sanctions. Here, it might seem as if Russia is the villain.
Podría parecer Rusia como el malvado acá.
Claro. A ver, no.
Sure, let's see. No. Crystal clear. Trump already said it. It's just that Greenland, as everyone knows, the Russians and the Chinese have wanted to take it over for at least 1,500 years. This is something that, well, in fact, it's full of Russian and Chinese ships. Greenland is practically under siege. I think there's one research vessel about 500 kilometers away or something like that, the closest one. And it's civilian, so... but anyway, what does it matter? I mean, never let reality ruin your narrative. What for? But this is what's called, as you rightly point out, a strong, firm, defiant statement. I'm going to pull down Mrs. von der Leyen's pants.
Yes, a copy and paste of von der Leyen's statements in favor of Ukraine and against Russia. All that talk about territorial integrity, sovereignty. At least in those, Russia is mentioned as the villains of the story.
It's funny that these people, the ones who used to defend the rules-based international order, have just now remembered, Mrs. von der Leyen included, about international law. All of a sudden she said, "Oh right, I'd forgotten about that. Let's bring it up now." So which is it? You're against international law. And besides, Trump already said it. International law is whatever he says it is. Meaning he basically doesn't care about procedures at all. International law is him. Just like that. So, well, let's see in the coming days, and probably for longer, the spectacular experiment of a divided Europe. And well, we've already seen it. I mean, when you see those soldiers getting off the plane, they looked more like a tourist group than an expeditionary force. I mean, that's pretty much it, a tourist trip. They haven't really done, well, you tell me what these people are going to do. So, well, there you have it.
Around here, Fernando, von der Leyen's statements. If von der Leyen's statements created the feeling of an invisible enemy,
do you have the video of the... I'll read it later, I just remembered. Do you have the video of the head of the Danish Arctic troops talking about how dangerous the Russians and the Chinese are?
One about the killing of wolves.
No. This one's really good. This one is... Wait, I'll tell you later.
Well, now we're going to get into it because people... Look, I understand that. There are some weighty statements here, Fernando.
I understand that. No, but it has to be said that people, especially in Latin America, aren't used to the European madhouse, the Euro madhouse. I mean, this, even if we say it jokingly, is true. That the Europeans have sent 30-some soldiers, that's true. I mean, and the deal they've made, I know it sounds like a joke, but this really is a joke. Europe is grotesque. Anyway, let's move on to Caja Callas, who's surely more solid.
More doubt, right? Yes, because if in von der Leyen's statement, the United States didn't even appear as the imminent threat against Greenland, well, here it directly presents Russia and China as the ones responsible for the danger of a US invasion of Greenland, indeed. Pay attention to Caja Callas. China and Russia must be having a great day. They are the ones who benefit from divisions among the allies. If Greenland's security is at risk, we can address it within NATO. Tariffs risk impoverishing Europe and the United States and undermining our shared prosperity. We also cannot allow our dispute to distract us from our main task, helping to end Russia's war against Ukraine. Well, obviously Russia is to blame for this situation in Greenland, obviously.
Of course, those are the Chinese, who, as everyone knows, are the evil empire, like the Eye of Sauron. Really a terrible thing. And sure, it's kind of a joke, but that's the direction the discourse is going to take. Because in the end, if Trump insists, he's going to keep Greenland. That, well, no one should doubt. And the Europeans aren't going to do absolutely anything except make statements and that sort of thing. But of course, a narrative has to be created. And Mrs. Kajakalis is already starting with this narrative, following in Trump's footsteps, saying, well, let's see, in the end, we're going to give Greenland to the United States, within the framework of NATO, of course. That is, they'll protect it better from Russian and Chinese attacks, who, as I said, as everyone knows, have 2 penguins disguised there. Well, penguins are in the Arctic, but they have 2 bears. The Russians have polar bears there. I've seen them. And the Chinese might have walruses or something like that. Anyway, a delusional story, but that's what they'll end up telling us, that the Russians and the Chinese are to blame for this. No matter how absurd it is, it's going to take hold, you'll see, in the major media outlets.
En los grandes medios de comunicación.
Me participan de una información de último momento, Fernando.
I'm getting some breaking news, Fernando. Let's see. Europe is doubling down, apparently in response to this provocation against the entire unified European people by Donald Trump. The Europeans, and particularly the Germans, have decided to send an even larger military contingent. Attention, here are the images. Whoa! But how, Fernando? They're leaving Greenland.
¿Cómo, Fernando? ¿Están abandonando Groenlandia?
What do you say?
No, I mean our forces.
Yesterday on Ryanair too. It's cheaper, huh? Ryanair is cheaper. It's a European low-cost airline and all that. So they'll go there with no service at all, because Ryanair charges you for everything. I mean, come on.
In exclusive images from Bild, Deutsche Soldaten fliegen zurück. German soldiers are flying back home.
Mom, well, the Germans pulling out of Greenland. One day later. And have they told you anything? I mean, Mercedes, really unthinkable that the Europeans would run away. Who would have thought they'd end up running?
The interesting thing about this, Fernando, is that in the initial reports, they mentioned 13 German soldiers landing.
And there were 15 of them. How wicked.
And now 15. But actually, we were wrong, Fernando. What we're seeing here isn't a shameful retreat, but rather that the German soldiers clearly carried out a heroic rescue operation of 2 comrades who were possibly kidnapped by a polar bear. Yes, by the Chinese and the Russians, of course. It's a heroic operation, that's why they're leaving with 2 more soldiers than before. Now that you mention it, it makes perfect sense. It fits. But here we have exclusive footage of that operation. Let's take a look.
Imágenes exclusivas de esa operación, Fernando.
There they are, deciding where they're going, and that's it. We've already done the operations they mentioned.
Enough, yes.
They're a bunch of fools, aren't they? The Germans, I mean. Anyway, well, let's see. But the European madhouse is such that, as I said, if some Martians showed up, they'd start looking around and say, no one can make sense of this, we're leaving and not getting involved here. Because you've got Donald Trump's statements.
Yes. Oh, well, I don't talk about those.
I'm going to talk about that chicken thing, about that guy, the head of the Danish Arctic forces. He says the following.
Here you come first.
Attention, at your request, about the geopolitical and military consequences of the United States' intervention in Ireland. Politically speaking, it's a catastrophe, a conflict or a show of force on the territory of a country that is a NATO member by another country that is also a NATO member, and that country being the United States would mean the end of the world as we know it.
Well, I don't know Polish, but the word catastrophe is understandable. Yes, it's very clear.
But the end of the world as we know it. I mean, the war against Ukraine is a trifle. That's going nowhere. But the fact that Europeans are making fools of themselves and Donald Trump might take over Greenland actually matters to Americans. But come on, that's the end of the world. NATO is coming to an end. How are we supposed to live without NATO? I mean, we old-timers have been used to having NATO forever, since 1949. I mean, no, that can't be. Now seriously, how many times have we said here that NATO is finished, that it's a corpse, that it's dead? Well, like all decomposing corpses, since it's no longer functional, no longer useful for anything, Trump is going to finish it off. And I think that even if it's probably not, we don't know for sure either, Trump's main idea, it does create a kind of collateral, secondary, intentional effect. This is a way to formally put an end to NATO. And on top of that, it'll be the Europeans who end it, in quotes. Because Trump will come along and say, no, I'll take it. And they'll have no choice but to leave. But anyway, about the tags, I mean, if this isn't the time to talk about it, then why are you talking? I mean, really, it's something. I'm going to read you what that guy said, the one on the ship and all that, the boss. He says there's a Russian research vessel 300 nautical miles from the island, which is about 574 kilometers. It's extremely dangerous. He says, I don't see a NATO ally attacking another NATO ally. But of course, if Russia were to attack Greenland, my duty would be to defend it. And I would do so with Danish forces and of course within the framework of the North Atlantic Alliance. This is a bit of a tangent. And then he says, right now we're looking at the world, and we can see that when the war in Ukraine ends, hopefully with good results for Ukraine, well, you can already expect. The guy says, we expect Russia to use all the resources it has employed in Ukraine to attack Finland. It will use them in other regions, including the Arctic. Therefore, we really expect an increase in Russian activity in the island region over the next year. It's something insane. I mean, the head of the Danish forces there says no, that he can't even imagine they'd attack the Americans, the ones saying they want to keep the island, that the ones who are going to attack are the Russians, who haven't said anything. I mean, and he says, no, there's a Russian ship around there circling, studying those poles and so on. But this is very dangerous. And then he says, and switches to Ukraine, that when the war in Ukraine ends, which we hope the Ukrainians win, well, don't hold your breath, because they're not going to win. In other words, you'll get tired of waiting. And he says no. And then we already know that after this, when it's over, the Russians will come for Greenland. Is this the boss? Careful, this guy is the commander of the Arctic forces. Inamaka Anderson is the man's name. And this was created by Reuters. This guy, from the ship, there's even a video of him, and you think, look, as we were saying before, Kallis, they're already sketching out the shameful excuse of, well, since the Russians are coming, it's better if the Americans take it. It's madness. But really, Europe, I don't know if you have, it's just so people can see the mess we've got right now in Europe. The footage, Fernando, of the protests. Do you have the statements from the leader of Alternative for Germany, Alice Weidel, about this?
No, ready. I can present them in 2 seconds. Fernando, these are the demonstrations against the American annexation of Greenland in the Danish capital, the very beautiful city of Copenhagen. Demonstrations by the Danes against this. Now,
ecological with bicycles.
Danish people, why didn't you hold these demonstrations when the government decided to send the few weapons Denmark had to the war in Ukraine, without the slightest sense? Because now these demonstrations aren't going to help much. No, I don't think so. Don't let them impress you. They don't impress Trump. This turnout, not much.
A little late, my dears, the demonstrations.
We have to support Greenland and let Trump know that we're not going to sell our country.
No, they're just going to let them use it. They're not going to sell it.
I think they would sell it. Sovereignty is already sold. Sovereignty was sold with the war in Ukraine. Now suddenly, a burst of nationalism. And a little too late, guys.
Yes. No. And besides, this is, well, just some homegrown parlor nationalism. The kind of Sunday or Saturday nationalism you turn to when you've got nothing better to do and decide to put on this little show for fun. But that's it. It's going nowhere. Just look at the fighting spirit of these Danes here, older than dirt, because Europe's population is aging. So unless they send in the retirees, this is ridiculous. They should, I mean it, they really should. Given Europe's capabilities and its absolute vassalage, its dependence on the United States, and its servility, since we're tied up every which way, they should just sell it. Let me give an example. Imagine that Europeans, in a fit of madness, go and say, all right, we're going to slap Trump with 500% tariffs and send troops to Greenland. But really, there's not much to be done, you know? I mean, it's enough for him to say, look, Europeans, you used to trade with the Russians, right? You had Russian gas, but you don't anymore. You've got American liquefied natural gas now. So, if I cut off your American liquefied natural gas, you'll have neither Russian gas nor American gas. You'll be left without gas. So if you don't give me Igoroland, well then, your companies and your homes can heat themselves with wood from European trees, which we don't really have either, because we've destroyed most of the forests in Europe. I mean, just to give an example of the many things Trump could do, he wouldn't even need to send the Sixth Fleet or anything like that. I mean, just by saying, you're cut off from gas, they panic and hand over Greenland, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, everything, whatever they want. All of this, honestly, is pathetic. And the European leaders are making fools of themselves on the world stage. Right now, we've got everyone, the leaders of about 150 countries, if we exclude the Western ones, laughing their heads off. Because these guys, let's be honest, we've got nothing. I mean, NATO with help from, even though Trump has now limited the aid and all that, which he hasn't really limited that much. But anyway, the key thing is American intelligence. That's what really matters, right? It provides everything from Starlink for communications to Earth observation satellites, all kinds of intelligence, right? Missile guidance, everything. Well, with Trump's intelligence, with the Americans, and with the Europeans sending, well, those tanks that are useless and other kinds of weapons. I mean, basically with massive logistical problems. The Europeans are within the European continent. They send things to Ukraine, which is relatively close, and we still have huge logistical issues, even with American help, right? Imagine without American help. You'd have to go to Greenland, crossing the Atlantic Ocean toward the Arctic. And we don't even have ships. No joke. I mean, if there had to be a large-scale deployment of European personnel, of European troops, and not just sending a handful of fools to put on a show, we wouldn't have the transport. We'd have to start confiscating cargo ships because we don't have any. I mean, to carry out an operation, we don't have the logistics to maintain Greenland. And on top of that, against the United States, which is right next door. So just to get an idea of how absurd that would be, that's why I say the best thing the Danes can do is accept Trump's offer, which is quite generous, $700 billion offered. Come on, if Greenland is actually costing you money because you have to subsidize it, sure, it's rich in resources and all that, but exploiting them costs a lot of money. It requires major investments that the Danes don't have. So, but what's more, look at what I'm telling you. The other day I was listening to a very interesting Russian analyst who had also served in the US Army, and he said, well, the next step is Iceland, which has 300,000 people, no army, and is also in NATO. I mean, in Iceland it's freezing cold, but you also have heat because of geothermal energy, which makes it great for the data centers of big American tech companies. That's one of the reasons they want to take over Greenland. In other words, that would be the next step. But you can imagine how much resistance the Icelanders are going to put up. So, well, they can keep going with Svalbard, where there are even fewer people. In other words, that way they're closing off the Arctic.
Or the statements of a German patriot, Alice Weidel, the leader of AfD, currently the most popular party in Germany, according to the polls, one of the parties of the new far right. Here's Alice Weidel, in her own words. Fernando, would you like to introduce them yourself?
Fernando, ¿quieres presentarlas vos?
Well, let's see. My Russian isn't very good, but I have it written down here. It's what he said, more or less.
He's speaking in German, right? But anyway, yes, the subtitles are in Russian, because it's the Russian channel.
My German isn't good either, huh? Same thing happens with Russian. It's not good either. Come on, whatever you prefer.
Go ahead, you present it. Come on, go.
Well, this lady... Let's see, we need to put ourselves in context to understand the ideological and all-around confusion we have in Europe. This lady belongs to a party we would describe as far-right, hyper-nationalist. In fact, it has an internal faction that is neo-Nazi. That is, it's a minority, but it's neo-Nazi. In other words, the hardline far-right.
Well, this lady, rather than being called a neo-Nazi, would be called a Nazi, because the hardline faction openly glorifies Hitler. Not even neo-Nazi anymore, indeed. To give people some context, this lady, from a far-right party, is a lesbian.
I think it's perfectly fine that she's a lesbian, but, well, it doesn't really fit with the ideology. And she's not only a lesbian, but she also lives in her usual, or at least official, residence in Switzerland, is married to another woman, and has adopted 2 children. She doesn't seem to be the prototype of the family model defended by a far-right party that promotes the traditional family. So we're already saying this. There's something here that doesn't add up, right? Clashes.
Yes, to top it off, her partner isn't another blonde German like her. No, not fair-haired, an Asian migrant from, I can't remember where, Bangladesh, one of those places, yes. But this lady, married to an Asian woman, so she's not exactly very...
Not very. Well, this already leaves you a bit puzzled. But this is the party that, while Merkel and previously Scholz were pro-Ukraine war and in favor of confronting the Russians, this is the party that's saying, no, let's not confront the Russians. That's outrageous. Look at what Ms. Weidel says here. Putin violated international law in 2022 when he invaded Ukraine. And since then, there has been constant outrage. He's even been called a murderer, without any acknowledgement that Russia also sees its security interests threatened by NATO's eastward expansion. She's siding with the Russians. The far right, huh? So, that struggle... Anyway, Trump is implementing the Monroe Doctrine, essentially the same logic, just from the other side. That is, comparing him to Putin. He says the doctrine means not tolerating any hostile power in America's backyard, including South America. We've heard years of loud outrage over Putin violating international law. Now those same critics are strangely silent when Trump does what they criticized Putin for doing. The Russian president violating the sovereignty of Venezuela and with Greenland. Let's see, there's a problem here. The far right defending international law, Russia's security needs, and opposing clearly what Trump wants to do in Greenland. While the Democratic, Social Democratic, Socialist Conservative, and Christian Democratic parties are against Russia and are going to compromise on Venezuela. Sorry, not Venezuela. They've already compromised on Greenland, I mean.
I mean, just so we can see to what extent this is. Anyway, Fernando, Beyond focusing on the double standard, the hypocrisy, the inconsistency of Europe, she didn't reject the invasion of Greenland as a German patriot, but rather her words on the matter were as follows. In any case, precisely after this denunciation of Europe's contradictions, we will assess any action by other states based on whether or not it benefits Germany's interests. That is our criterion. We do not interfere in others' affairs. So as we can see here, it's quite interesting to observe this to some extent. There is a double standard and double morality, but we will not intervene in others' affairs.
Let's see, but that's consistent with them. Of course, because they're critical of the European Union and, to some extent, of NATO, more so of the European Union. But anyway, let the Danes handle it however they can. I don't care. I want to get rid of the European Union. But well, ultimately, even though this is clearly a strategic policy of confrontation with Merkel, saying the exact opposite to discredit her, obviously, and they probably don't even believe what they're saying, still, look, in the end, they're defending the same position as the Russians and the Chinese, non-interference in the internal affairs of other states. That's a problem. In any case, let it be up to the Security Council.
But the United States could carry out a defense of the European continent as a European one, not as a supporter of the European Union, but as that of a neighboring country, a bordering one, like Germany. In the name of German patriotism, it could respond, "We reject US interference," and yet, quietly.
Yeah, man, because look, ultimately we can't forget that Germany, whether it's Alternative for Germany saying it, the Greens or whoever, Germany is a vassal. No, I mean this. Germany is a protectorate, a creation of the United States, and it can't say no to the United States. If tomorrow the US came and said, look, I'm going to take, I don't know, Bavaria, just to say something, well, they'd take it, and the Germans would swallow it. I mean, they're absolutely dependent on the United States. They were put there. Adenauer was put there, I mean, by the Americans.
A pretty strange kind of German nationalism, isn't it? No, downright bizarre. A very peculiar kind of nationalism.
Well, let's see. Just so we understand the mess. By the way, I don't know if you have it handy. It's worth seeing the photo. We already know that the other day Macron had a little vein pop here and his eye was red.
Then he apologized.
Yeah. Look, we all suspect it was Brigitte, but he says it wasn't. And now a photo has come out that I have here with sunglasses, because you can see his eye like this, supposedly from the slap Brigitte might have given him. Anyway, he's wearing these really flashy sunglasses, bright blue, something like that. Macron said he attended a meeting at the Élysée Palace wearing sunglasses because a blood vessel in his eye had burst. I apologize for these glasses, which are related to a minor issue, but I have to wear them for a while, so you'll have to put up with me like this, he joked. So that's what Macron is up to now. The sunglasses, kind of tacky ones. Apparently they couldn't find any others, and he has to apologize for them.
Do you remember Julian Robb?
Oh, the pro-Ukrainian hyper-analyst, yes.
The military expert from Bild, Germany's most widely read morning paper, owned by the Axel Springer media group, the country's most important one, somewhat like the Prisa group in Spain, the Clarín group in Argentina, or Televisa in Mexico, the media owners of Germany. This man, a fierce anti-Russian, a fanatical Russophobe, devoted to Ukraine, and now a bit angry, suddenly, with Donald Trump. Here are his statements. This is what imperialist despots do. But for a US president to do it is outrageous. Trump is destroying the transatlantic alliance. For us, this can only mean more military, more of our own weapons, more European security. The United States is pulling out of the game. It's heartbreaking.
Poor Julian. Poor Julian. Ah, well. His side is losing in Ukraine, and now Trump is going to take away the land lease from the Danes. What a streak the man's on. The year's off to a bad start for him.
This is what imperialist despots do. When I read that, my first reaction was to think, this man is talking about the United States, but for a US president to say that, so who's the imperialist despot then?
No, for God's sake. For God's sake. An American president. They've never invaded anything, right? I mean, no, Vietnam, Korea, the island of Grenada, Panama, well, bombed Libya, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan. Those are just the ones I can remember off the top of my head. Come on, no. They've never invaded anything. There's a photo out there, I'll see if I can find it, I just remembered, that shows a bunch of presidents, I don't know, maybe from Reagan or earlier, American presidents, with what each one has invaded. And then below, they're more or less contemporary Chinese counterparts. And underneath it says, nothing, 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 nothing. So on top, the Americans, a huge list, and their contemporary Xi Jinping, nothing, Jiang Zemin, nothing. It's funny because of that. But apparently the bad guys are the Chinese, who haven't invaded anyone since 1979, which was ages ago. Well, I mean...
Regarding the situation here, oh well, one thing.
Let's see, because yes, I have it here. So we can look at the issue. Supposedly, anti-imperialist demands should come from the European left. But since there's practically no left anymore, I mean, what we have are progressives, like in Spain, like Sumar, Podemos, that crowd, right? Well, the progressives in the end are basically the fifth column within an almost non-existent left. Because let's be honest, at least in Europe, the left is nowhere to be found. I mean, it's gone missing in action, and maybe, who knows, it'll come back next century, but right now it doesn't exist. And the little that does exist, like in Germany, I can never pronounce this woman's last name, Sarah Wagenknecht, or however you say it, they've been pushed to the margins and can't even reach 5%. And if they reach 5% of the votes, well, they pull a fast one on them, basically a manipulation. They take votes away, and that's it. And that's that. In other words, zero chances. The little that's even somewhat salvageable, basically nothing. So now it's the same old far right, maybe a bit recycled, or with a thin coat of polish, that's denying the anti-terrorist narrative. Look at what Jordan Bardella, one of the leaders of Marine Le Pen's national rally, says. The external overthrow of a government by force only worsens global imbalances and fuels geopolitical instability. He's talking about Venezuela, you know. According to President Trump's own admission, this intervention in Venezuela paves the way for the economic interests of U.S. oil companies. Trump is thus reviving the Monroe Doctrine, no matter the cost. That is to say, supporting Venezuela. Let's see, there's something here. We see everyone going crazy. I mean, you, sir, from the far right, just do what you've always done. Stick to your usual business. But of course, since these people are sovereigntists and therefore have to go against the globalists, and Geert Wilders is a sovereigntist but defends globalization, I know that's contradictory, but, well, or imperialism if you prefer. So of course, those who are all in the opposition have to confront globalist governments. They have to take positions contrary to their policies, which are pro-Trump, pro-United States, not so much pro-Trump, but definitely pro-United States, pro-imperialist. And naturally, the others take the opposite stance, as an electoral strategy. But this is the crazy, schizophrenic world of Europe that we're caught up in. Anyway, I mean, that's how it is.
Here in Spain, they're thinking it over and deciding it's better not to, given this madness. Fernando, Mr. Dmitry Medvedev, illustrating a post with this image, made the following statement. Number 1. The United States is preparing to attack Greenland, prioritizing possession of the island over Atlantic solidarity. Any insolent European will be punished with tariffs for NATO protection. Number 2. The French authorities have announced that they are leaving NATO. This happened yesterday. Number 3. Tymoshenko, the Ukrainian politician, has declared that Ukraine has a fascist regime and that the country will not last more than 5 years. This because of
accusation of corruption, yes.
Following a corruption accusation. And by the way, they found quite a bit of cash in her house, so it's just that this lady spends a lot, and that's why she needs to have cash. It's just that the traffic, fascist government, according to one of the...
Now, when they're coming after you, this thing about them being fascists when they go after me for corruption, but before, when they let me steal, they weren't fascists.
Number 4. The President and the Prime Minister of Moldova have spoken in favor of dissolving their own country. Yes. Maria Sandu, in an interview last week, said she wants Moldova to unite with Romania. Number 5. Trump will soon announce contact with extraterrestrials. Why not? News from this past week. At first, I thought these were absurd predictions, like the ones I made in 2022 or 2024, but no, they're news from the last few days. It turns out my predictions are coming true. And just like that, Dimitri, indeed, all these crazy things are now reality.
Well, of course, a friend of yours, and mine too, very dear, very admired, British, Piers Morgan, quite the upstanding guy, or rather the complete opposite. This guy's a disgrace. Well, he used to be an MP, and now he's got a TV show or something like that. So this man said, after imposing tariffs on countries that oppose Greenland belonging to the United States, that Britain should then buy back the United States because it once belonged to them, and that way it would strengthen North Atlantic security. Seen that way, you could buy it back. Sure, we could all start making historical claims which would be hilarious, sorry for the word, because we could all claim a bunch of things. Since we've been colonial powers, well,
Here, according to information from the British Daily Star, news from the United States, Donald Trump will make the most important announcement in history at the World Cup. Exclusive, British documentarian Mark Lee claims that insiders in Washington have told him that the President of the United States has already written the speech. And pay attention to the announcement Trump has planned for the opening of the 2026 World Cup in the United States, Mexico, and Canada.
Attention, what a World Cup.
The whistleblower, the mole, and retired U.S. Air Force Major David Grush recently claimed that Trump might soon reveal that the U.S. government possesses extraterrestrial remains and has been visited by UFOs on numerous occasions. Grush stated that the president had been fully briefed on incidents involving crashed spacecraft, the existence of multiple extraterrestrial races, the origin of these beings, and their intentions on Earth. Apparently, dear Fernando, according to this publication, during the opening ceremony of the World Cup, Trump will soon make the most important announcement in the history of humanity regarding human contact with extraterrestrial beings.
Well, look, they'd already been saying this about us. No, we'd been saying it. Look, Star Trek isn't a movie, it's real. Star Trek is real, and as you know, they've traveled through time. Sometimes they've gone to the 20th century, the 21st, they've contacted us, Ezekiel and me. So we already know what's going to happen, that's why we're so accepting, because they keep telling us. But anyway, yeah, I think the announcement is going to go in another direction. I think he's going to get there, and in the inaugural speech, he's going to say, "And now I declare the North American team the winner without the need to play a single match." And that's it. Let them deal with it, except for the fact that they haven't given him the Nobel Prize. Well, Karina gave it to him, but that doesn't count. They told him from Norway that no, she can give it to him, but they're not giving him the Nobel. She gives him the little commemorative medal, but no.
de recordatorio, pero no. Entonces, directamente dice, pues me quedo yo con la copa de...
So he just says, well, I'll keep the FIFA Cup for myself. Besides, they'd already given him the FIFA award, right? The Peace Prize to Trump. So then, what's the next step? Handing him the world champion title directly? What are you waiting for, FIFA officials? Come on, do it already. And let the rest play for second and third place. I mean, or maybe they've got it all rigged, which wouldn't surprise me either. Because considering what FIFA has done over so many World Cups and all that, everything's fixed, so certain teams win no matter what, with those spectacular refereeing decisions and penalties called left and right. But anyway, about that World Cup to be held in Canada, with McCarthy, the Canadian Prime Minister, practically going to China to ask for reinforcements before they invade.
Primer ministro canadiense yéndose a China poco menos que a pedir refuerzos antes de que lo invadan. Es decir, aliarse con los chinos, como sea ya.
That is, to get involved with the Chinese any way possible, commercially or otherwise, because they see there's not much of a future. Mexico, what can we even say about Mexico? It's on the list of countries to invade, Trump's list. So it's going to be a World Cup where, if they end up facing each other, and now the matchups, Mexico versus the United States versus Canada, it's going to be a mess. Because unless the rules have changed, the host countries, that is, the ones organizing the World Cup, are automatically qualified. They don't need to qualify. So those three play. Those three definitely play.
As group leaders, by the way.
Sure. There could be some spectacular clashes there. What happened in Minneapolis will look like nothing compared to this. But anyway, I do think that's the direction things are heading, because soccer gets way more attention during the World Cup than anything else. And the US winning the World Cup is much more important than peace, which nobody cares about, or Eurovision, which are things that just don't. But soccer, yes. Anyway, this is the Western Circus. There's really no other way to describe it. But hey, it's only January 18th, right? I mean, this is barely even started.
That Trump is going to give us a year. With a bit more seriousness, we can begin analyzing the situation in Syria.
This is more serious. Oh, well, he said, there's one thing. He said the Italian minister jokingly, something like this. The Italian minister of defense, Crosetto, or something like that, said 5 Italians, 15 French, 15 Germans, and Dutch. And he said, to me it sounds like the beginning of a joke. And it's true, this thing about 3 Spaniards, 2 Germans, a Frenchman, and so on a plane. And then one said, the plane is going to crash. And another replied, well, you jump. I mean, what does that sound like? We're pathetic to this extent. And well, now the thing about Syria really is more serious. This is no longer about Euroland or the Euro asylum, but rather we're going to the place where important things happen, not these parodies of politics that Europeans put on.
In Aleppo, or rather across the entire Aleppo front, fighting between the Syrian state troops, loyal to al-Gulani, and the troops of the Syrian Democratic Forces, as they call themselves, basically the Kurdish troops, who until recently controlled half of Syria, right? Here are more images. Almost half of Syria. And until recently, the oil wells, or at least the areas with Syria's oil wells, specifically in Aleppo. Everything is looking more and more like a civil war, just as predicted here.
There they are celebrating.
The victory. Now we'll talk about what has happened. Fernando, what's the situation here? Could you introduce it a bit while I go over the map and show images at the same time?
Okay, yes. Within the complexity that is Syria, this is the oversimplified version because the situation is so complex that even I have trouble keeping track of it. Well, not just me, anyone really, especially because of the alphabet soup. Because if you've got the SDF, the STS, in the end you get yourself into a real mess. So to get our bearings, the Syrians controlled most of northern Syria and above all, everything along the bank. I'm not sure if it was the left or the right. There's always some confusion. But anyway, up north of the Euphrates River, which is where most of the oil fields are. They were, well, it has to be said that the Kurds.
Los kurdos. Los kurdos, perdón, los kurdos. Hay que decir que los kurdos originalmente.
Right, so the Kurds. It must be said that the Kurds originally, the predominantly Kurdish populations and so on, were in a border area with Turkey, some already further toward Iraq, etc. But they were fairly small areas. That is, as a result of the civil war in Syria, they, with the support of the United States and Israel, and well, because they also worked hard for it, to be fair, ended up taking control of a huge area, much larger than their original populations, the settlements they had in northern Syria, creating a scenario that included everything on one side of the Euphrates, with cities as important at the time as Raqqa.
Y con ciudades tan importantes en su momento como Raqqa. Raqqa fue la capital del Estado Islámico, no oficial.
Raqqa was the capital of the Islamic State. Not officially. I passed through Raqqa, by the way, before all this, I didn't actually get to see it. And Raqqa was quite a substantial city. Where I did sleep was in a key city, which is Deir ez-Zor. That one was, well, kind of... Let's see, Deir ez-Zor was in the hands of the Syrian army of Bashar al-Assad, and now there was, well, a Kurdish part there. All of this is along the Euphrates. I mean, I was sleeping in Deir ez-Zor. Just so you get an idea, you can cross the Euphrates, and it's a family of some guy, of course. So what's going on? The state forces don't control everything, not by a long shot. There, everything you see in yellow, all of that, that's the Euphrates, Fernando. It's the Euphrates.
Everything you see in yellow is Kurdish. And here are Al-Golani's headcutters.
Indeed.
And then they have here.
Yes, that little piece is Turkish. The Turks are there, just like in Afrin. Afrin is this corner here, the western corner, up north, right next to Turkey. Well, that was also Kurdish at one point, but they were driven out by Turkish troops, the militias that support Turkey. To simplify, there are 5 or 6 major groups here. I'm really simplifying because there's also a tribal structure that makes the tribes from one place or another switch sides every so often, which makes it all a mess. But basically, there's the current Syrian government, the former Al-Qaeda, rebranded, that is Al-Julani, now the leader, and the president of the Syrian state, internationally recognized. Then there are the Kurds, the ones in yellow up north, also controlling the oil region, this is important, or a good part of it. Then there are the Americans, who still have some small units in the Kurdish area. Careful, it's always important to point this out. Israelis and Americans support the Kurds. Obviously, the Turks hate them and want to drive the Kurds out of Syria and everywhere else, if they could, even from their own country, which is where most Kurds live, in Turkey, in Turkish Kurdistan. Also, the Kurdish militias in Syria have long supported the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which was the Kurdish group opposing the Turks in Turkey. The PKK, yes, the PKK. The historic PKK of Abdullah Öcalan, mispronounced by the way. He announced not long ago, just last year, that they were stopping their fighting and so on.
From a prison in Turkey, if I remember correctly, right?
Yes, yes. He's been in a prison in Turkey for about 20 or 30 years. I mean, they captured him in one of those rather convoluted and murky operations, because several countries were involved, he went to several places and so on. But anyway, it was the Turkish Secret Services. And since then, he's been there in a high-security prison, serving a life sentence. At first, he was sentenced to death, but then they commuted the sentence to life imprisonment because it was more useful to them than turning him into a hero and martyr. So then what's going on? Well, we also had, and still have, this part you see here, kind of flesh-colored, more or less. That's where the Americans are.
Esta de ahí están los norteamericanos. Tienen sus milicias respectivas, pero ahí tiene una base, Al-Tanaf.
They each have their own militias, but there's a base there, Al-Tanaf, I think it's called. Then on the coast, you have the Alawites, that is a kind of Shiite group, but not exactly Shiite, and they were the community of Hafez al-Assad, the president. Alongside them are also the Christians, and so on. Then we have the Druze, in the south, near Israel. The Druze are there, the Israelis also support the Druze and have given them military backing, and so on, against the government of al-Yurani and the Arab tribes that support it. Because let's say the al-Yurani government is obviously Sunni, and the others are not Sunnis. In fact, they're not even Muslims in the strict sense. Well, we have this composition, plus what's left of the Islamic State, which consists of a few scattered groups, mainly in uncontrolled desert areas. So what's happened these past few days, and today, in fact today is the very latest, is that there was an offensive, because part of Aleppo was controlled by the Kurds. Well, there was an offensive by the army. It must be said that the official Syrian army, al-Yuranis, is currently allied with the Turks. That is, more or less follows Turkish interests. And the Turkish interests, as you know, are to crush the Kurds. Well, they launched an offensive with Turkish support and practically drove out the Kurds. And then another offensive, see this yellow area? Well, in this yellow area they wiped them out. The Kurds had to withdraw from here. And what's worse, today in the south, well, in the southern part of the Kurdish area on the Euphrates, which flows down toward Iraq, I have to say I'll give myself some credit. When I was in the Iraq War and in Syria, I was 30 kilometers from the Iraqi border and absolutely nothing was happening. I'm telling you, I felt safer and calmer there than here, in my own neighborhood. Anyway, they went in but had to withdraw because of the pressure, mainly from the Arab tribes allied with al-Yurani's government. This whole area is a key oil region. Here is Al Omar, a very important oil field within Syria, and another one nearby, the Conoco field. This is an oil-producing area that used to be controlled by the Kurds and the Americans, since until just 2 days ago, both had a military presence throughout this Kurdish region, with military bases. I think they still have one left, but the Americans have practically pulled everything out of there under Trump's current administration. And of course, with the government, that is the current one, taking over the oil region, it's as if the Turks had taken it, because the Turks smuggle oil both from Iraq and now plan to do so from here. And this is at first glance a blow to American interests and to Israeli interests, historical allies of the Kurds, and vice versa. First lesson to take from this. How many times have we said it? I don't know. You can never trust the West in general, and the Americans in particular. You can never be their ally, because they'll abandon you when it suits them. That's exactly what the Americans have just done. We'll see what the Israelis do. Leave them stranded. Completely stranded. The thing is, we have to mention what I said before. Why are they being praised for this? Oh, how great, how great. Besides joining the winning side, which is part of it, it's because they're Arabs, because this whole area is an Arab region. As I said, the Kurds only control the Koban area and so on, in the northern border region with Turkey, where the historic Kurdish enclaves are. Everything else was occupied by a coalition of Kurds and Arabs, who were mainly opposed to the Islamic State. Well, these Arabs are the ones who have switched sides, and that's what's causing the Kurds' withdrawal to be so severe right now. The blow is devastating. That is to say, they're being left with, they've already had to swallow an agreement that I believe has already been signed, one that al-Yurani made with them, in which they came out losing. If they had integrated back in Bashar al-Assad's time with the autonomy that Bashar al-Assad granted them, they would have been much better off, with a much better future than the one they'll have now. 12 points have been signed, of which the key ones are: Kurdish fighters must integrate into the Syrian army individually, not as separate units. In other words, the Kurdish militias are being dissolved. And note this: border crossings with Iraq are to be handed over to state control.
Entrega bajo control estatal de los pasos fronterizos con Irak. Clave, porque los kurdos recibían armamento a través de...
Key, because the Kurds were receiving weapons through the border crossings with Iraq. From now on, weapons and other things, that is, oil, was being smuggled and so on. No, this will now be controlled by the Al-Urani group, the recycled Al-Qaeda people. Another point: hand over under state control, withdrawal of Kurdish forces from the provinces of Deir ez-Zor, the one we've seen, and Raqqa, where the majority of the population is Arab. Those we've seen that, boom, are gone. Hand over to the state of control over all oil and gas facilities. They're left with nothing. Creation of a joint administration for the province of Hasaka in the north, within the area controlled by the Kurds. Well, this is merely symbolic. Joint administration. Basically, it's going to be run by the Al-Urani people. Appointment of the Kurdish commander, Mazlum Abadi, as governor of Hasaka province. Well, a small concession to one side, because if you look, Hasaka is way up north, in the area more or less close to where the Kurds had their historical settlements. This is more of a symbolic concession, since he's not going to do anything. Assignment of state functions to Kurdish representatives. For example, Deputy Minister of Defense, Affairs and Lands. Permission to take part in the work of the Syrian parliament. You can imagine how much the Syrian parliament matters. This is a dictatorship. Confirmation of the recognition of Kurdish rights in accordance with the recent decree by President Ahmed al-Sara. In practice, nothing, zero. And implementation of all the points according to the established schedule. They've really hardened their positions. All Syrian governments are much tougher than Basil Assad's. Well, this is what happens when you listen to the Americans and the Israelis. They'll drop you whenever they feel like it. Besides, they never learn when it doesn't suit them. The Kurds, this has happened to them plenty of times already. It's not the first. The Americans have used them and then abandoned them.
Que los norteamericanos les han utilizado y luego los han tirado. No olvidemos que...
Let's not forget that in World War I, among the agreements that were made, I don't remember which one it was, because there were several agreements and then re-agreements. One of the things that was agreed upon and later undone was the creation of a Kurdish state by the British, the French, etc., when the war ended, or at the end of World War I. Then it wasn't done. In other words, the Westerners have already been betrayed many times, and they don't realize it. They don't want to realize it. So this changes, it starts to change, because we have a Syria increasingly influenced by the Turks, where they want to establish, and were trying to establish, military bases, something the Israelis were bombing. This leads us to the fact that once the Kurdish issue is quote-unquote resolved, the confrontation between Turkey and Israel in Syria will become increasingly likely. It will be almost quasi-direct. And we'll see from there how things develop. But this is to show us what the world looks like. And when we say it's a world war, notice that at the same time this is happening, the defeat in Yemen had just taken place. Not in the Yemen controlled by the Houthis, by Ansar Allah, who are Shiites, no. In the part controlled by the Saudis and the Emiratis, a proxy war between Saudis and Emiratis, where the Saudis have swept the Emiratis aside. And right now, the war in the Middle East and Africa between Saudis and Emiratis, with shifting alliances, is brutal.
Just to give you an idea, the Saudis. Two little things, Fernando, before we start the analysis. Two things about the context leading up to this situation. Until 2011, when the Arab Spring began in the Arab world, promoted by the United States through the CIA, by the United Kingdom through MI6, and by Israel through the Mossad, until 2011, for better or worse, Syria seemed unified, governed by Bashar al-Assad's government. A descendant or member of one of the many minorities, the Alawites, those particular Shiites, with, undoubtedly, an authoritarian regime, quite different from liberal democracies, but with religious freedom, freedom of worship, and liberties unthinkable today under the current Syrian regime. The Druze were more or less content, the Alawites naturally as well, the Sunni majority without major problems, and the Kurds with a certain degree of autonomy in the northwestern part. Indeed. In 2011, the Arab Color Revolution began, one of the chapters of the Arab Spring, and that naturally created a scenario of destabilization, insurrection, and civil war. Much, much worse, even, when instead of the so-called freedom fighters, as they were called, instead of young people inspired by liberal democracies, university students, promoters of a democratic regime in Syria, suddenly the leaders of the uprisings, or rather, of the government, the Islamic State, known in that region as Daesh, appeared. At first, these supposedly free-thinking young people led the protests against the government, but in that chaotic situation, the Islamic army landed, and eventually these rebels began to join the forces opposing al-Assad's government, commanded by the Islamic State. In fact, at one point the Syrian troops retreated so far that the fall of the government seemed likely, until al-Assad decided to call in the Russians. The Americans were already involved in all this, supporting the jihadists. Indeed, yes, at first under the pretext of promoting freedom and progressive, pro-European, pro-Western rebels.
Progresistas, pro-europeos, pro-occidentales. Bueno, después participaban los estadounidenses ayudando.
Well, later the Americans got involved, helping the jihadists, but without being physically present, only through airstrikes. Then, at al-Assad's request, Russia intervened. The Russians landed, not only with armed forces, but even with ground support. And that led to al-Assad, the Syrian government, starting to reconquer most of Syrian territory. Not all of it, but practically all. So that's the situation, more or less everything under control. Until when? When was the Al-Gulani thing? A few months ago?
No.
No. At the end of the year before last. I mean, at the end of 2024, if I remember correctly.
End of 2024. Already more than a year? The ball, I remembered it as early 2025.
Then his spirits began to lift, that he was going to Europe, that he had been down.
Well, by the end of 2024, al-Assad's government was, theoretically, stable with Russia's support, but in reality mired in poverty due to the harsh economic sanctions imposed by the United States. Suddenly, a surprise attack occurs. The loyalist forces do not respond to this attack coming from the north, involving various militia groups, all united by one thing, their rejection of al-Assad and Russia, though with different backers. The support from... Let's introduce it here, before all this situation described by Fernando.
Let's see, they were in the Idlib pocket. The Idlib pocket was the only thing left of the jihadists concentrated there. And these are the ones carrying out an offensive prepared by the United States, Israel, and Turkey. And of course, through bribes to many of the generals and politicians, it turned into a very swift offensive.
Generals who were earning very little money as a result of the economic crisis caused by the sanctions begin, with the support of Turkey, Israel, and the United States, and with the Kurds, backed by the United States, also taking part in this, an offensive that leads to the fall of al-Assad and the flight of his troops, even into Iraq. You'll remember the images of that resistance. And from that point on, a division of Syria begins within the framework of a civil war. In a way, a civil war not yet fully unleashed, but rather, what's the word? Well, that is to say, a latent civil war, that's the word.
Una guerra civil latente, esa es la palabra, una guerra civil latente.
Muy caótica porque al-Giuliani no
Very chaotic, because al-Giuliani doesn't control all the Sunni groups. And within the Sunni groups, there are two major factions. Let's say, two main types of groups. Those more or less close to al-Qaeda, that is close to what used to be bin Laden's organization. This man was the head of al-Qaeda there in Syria for a long time. Then he reinvented himself. And the jihadists, let's say, or also Sunnis, of course, pro-Turkish, the pro-Turkish militias. These groups don't get along.
Estos dos grandes grupos no se llevan bien, para decirlo suavemente.
A partir de entonces, los kurdos.
From that point on, the Kurds conquered more territory than they had previously held. The Sunnis, for better or worse, emerged as the most dominant force in the entire region. But with the internal conflict Fernando mentioned, they were constantly attacking the Alawites in one area and the Kurds in another. The Americans also carried out an offensive, taking control of more territory than before, and that is the current situation. Until now, when we are witnessing advances by government forces against the Kurds, who were betrayed by the Americans.
Contra los kurdos traicionados por los estadounidenses. Lo que aparece acá de fondo, Fernando, sin duda.
What's really going on here in the background, Fernando, without a doubt, is what's going to trigger the final spark before the explosion. Basically, up to now, both Israel and the United States and Turkey, all enemies of al-Assad and his regime, appeared united in rejecting al-Assad's government, which is backed by Russia. But soon the conflict in Syria will begin between Turkey and Israel, the Turks with their own Sunni forces, and the Israelis with those.
The Russians, of course.
And with the support through the Mossad, al-Giuliani, al-Qaeda, and others, just like the Americans. That underlying and emerging dispute here in the background, right?
Of course, this has so far remained, as you say, latent. That is, with some Israeli bombings and attempts by the Turks and their militias to settle. But let's say there's already an agreement among the Turks, the Americans, and others, because Syria needs to be more or less unified, not left divided into a bunch of zones. That's why the offensive against the Kurds was allowed by the United States, because if the US says no, no offensive is possible. I mean, they allowed it to happen. That's why we talk about betrayal of the Kurds. This is going to sit very badly with Israel, because the Kurds are another historical ally of Israel. And of course, now they're going to meet face to face. Once you eliminate the rivals, only two remain, and those two are going to fight each other, with a state, al-Giuliani's, that right now is more pro-Turkish than pro-Israeli. That is to say, we'll see, because there are many competing interests here. But look at the move, because given how things were, the Saudis are saying, first, whoa, there are major tectonic shifts happening here. Let's make a deal with the Turks and with the Pakistanis. Careful. Look at what a shift this is. What a complete change. I mean, the Turks are the Muslim Brotherhood, that is, Erdogan's people. Up until now, the Muslim Brotherhood, that is, Turkey, Qatar, those who are banned in Egypt, Hamas, which is also part of the Muslim Brotherhood, supported each other. In fact, the Turks have a military base in Qatar. Well then, a change of alliances, a change of dance partners. And on the other side were the Wahhabis of a, well, Salafist bent. From Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, all that from Kuwait, etc. Bahrain, right? Change.
Bahrain, bien. Cambio. Arabia Saudí se va con los turcos.
Saudi Arabia sides with the Turks and with the Pakistanis, who aren't Arabs but are Sunnis, just like the Turks, but they're not Arabs. Why? And look, the other day, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Oman intervened to stop Trump and the Israelis in their attempt or intention to attack Iran. Why? Because what the Saudis don't want, and this goes beyond whether they get along better or worse with the Shiites, that is, the Saudi Sunnis, what they don't want is what the United States and Israel want to do: a regime change and the chaotic destabilization of Iran. Because that would affect them completely and absolutely. It would destabilize the Saudi area itself. But the same thing would also happen with the Turks and the Pakistanis. Notice that the Pakistanis share a border with the Iranians and in addition have a common problem: Baluchistan, which lies on both sides of the border and wants to be an independent state. But the Turks also share a border with the Iranians, just what they needed. In other words, if things blew up, they'd be left with the problem, because there are more Azeris, that is, more Azerbaijanis, in Iran than in Azerbaijan, along with the issue of the Kurds. The Kurds were being used in the protests of recent days as a shock force against the Iranian government, not the Iraqi one. Of course, if there's an enemy of the Turks or the Kurds, what they don't want is a more independent Kurdistan in Iran. In other words, they're already busy crushing the Kurds in Syria, so the last thing they want now is an independent Kurdish-Iranian Kurdistan. No way. Then what they want is stability. Right now, Pakistan, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia support the Shiites in Iran because they don't want the instability that an attack by Israel or the Americans would cause. A tectonic shift. Meanwhile, the Emiratis support the Israelis and the Americans. From there, the Saudis have focused on pounding the United Arab Emirates in Yemen. The United Arab Emirates supported the Southern Independence Forces, who wanted to create a state roughly along the borders of the former South Yemen, externally controlled and financed by the Emiratis. But the Emiratis made a wrong move, seizing part of the territory held by the Saudi proxies. The Saudis responded and have now expelled both the Emiratis and the separatists. At this point, they control all the territory that the separatists once held. Now, to simplify, we can say that Yemen is divided into two parts. What was more or less the former South Yemen, indirectly controlled by the Saudis, and what would be the former North Yemen, in its better days controlled by the Sana movement, by the Houthis. But they've kept going. Why? Because Israel keeps making moves, and so do the others. The Israeli-American bloc, look at that, goes and says, Israel, well, I'm going to recognize Somaliland, which was a phantom state not recognized by anyone, the result of Somalia's subdivision, a paradigmatic example of a failed state since the 1990s. So look at what, well, there, in the former French colony of Somalia, in the northern part, a state was created that no one recognized, de facto independent. But well, the Emiratis had bases there, not strictly military ones, but bases, that is, airports they used for their business and their wars. Airports that essentially were used to arm one of the sides in Sudan's civil war. In that war, there are two groups, the government and the Rapid Support Forces, which are a kind of paramilitary force that existed before they started fighting each other. Who is supporting whom right now? They've met, but who supports the government and who supports the Rapid Support Forces? The latter are backed by the Emiratis, and one of the key routes for sending weapons and mercenaries to the Rapid Support Forces is through the airports in Somaliland. That's why the first move was made by Israel, officially recognizing it as a state, and the second move was going to be made by the United Arab Emirates because it suited them as well. Quickly, the Saudis spoke with the Egyptians, the Turks, and of course the Somalis, and said, no, this isn't happening, not at all. And with the Sudanese, with the governments of Sudan, they hold a meeting. The ambassadors set up in a conquered area between Somaliland and Puntland, which is a region that hasn't declared independence but is de facto independent. And right now they've already expelled the Emiratis from both airports, or from the two areas they controlled, which were used for all those air transits, with mercenaries and weapons that came back loaded with gold. They came back loaded with gold. Wait, it gets messier. I'll finish this mess so you can see how things stand. In that brutal attack by the Saudis on Emirati interests, they've made General Khalifa Haftar, over there in Libya, who controls roughly half the country, expel the Emiratis from the area they controlled. They also had airports and other facilities there that the Emiratis used to support the Sudanese rebels. But from Chad, which was another route across the Chadian border and through the Libyan chaos, they entered by land into the area controlled by the rebels, which is the western part of Sudan. The Chadian government said, oh, there have been some border incidents and we're closing the border. In other words, clearly harming Emirati interests, funded by the Saudis. The Egyptians were putting pressure, and the Sudanese government was pressuring the Ethiopians, who also wanted to recognize Somaliland. Why? In this case, because since the creation of the state of Eritrea, they were left without access to the sea. And their access to the sea currently under the table was Somaliland. So they have an interest in Somaliland's ports. I think that's what had been happening until now, supplying them with everything and allowing them to trade through Somaliland, which means they were in favor of Somaliland and, let's say, aligned with the Emiratis, even though Ethiopia is Christian. Careful. Just so you can see the mess. On top of that, the Ethiopians have built a dam, the one they call the Renaissance Dam, which harms the Sudanese and the Egyptians because it's built on the Blue Nile. Then there's a reaction led by Saudi Arabia in the Middle East. And look, from Libya to the Horn of Africa, it's running counter to the interests of the Emiratis, the Israelis, and in a certain sense also the Americans. Just so you can see the mess that's taking shape. And if this doesn't blow up this year, it'll be a miracle. There are already wars. There's the civil war in Sudan. There are conflicts, from time to time, among minorities in Ethiopia. In Somalia, there have been wars nonstop for 40 years. But things could get much worse with foreign interventions. The tectonics, how things are shifting and how interests are changing depending on the circumstances. Because what the Saudis don't want is for that whole region to become destabilized, because that would sink them.
Now then, precisely based on this analysis, Fernando, the question about what happened a few days ago. To what extent did this emerging alliance between Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Pakistan, and partly Qatar as well, lead to the pullback, the last-minute retreat by the United States that night, when the American tanker planes were already appearing, the refueling aircraft were already in the air, the AWACS were in the air, and everyone already considered the attack imminent? In the end, Trump reversed course at the last moment, according to some voices even at Israel's request, though that seems unlikely, more rumor than fact. But the official request from Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, and others not to start this must have carried some weight. How much of that do you think determined the United States' last-minute retreat? Or does it respond to other factors, in your opinion?
I think there are several things. As always, there tend to be multiple factors when making a decision. One, obviously, is that the Saudis, along with Oman and Qatar and so on, told them yesterday, look, we're not going to support this. Obviously, they're not going to go against the United States or Israel, but they're not going to support this either. Notice that while the United Arab Emirates did sign the Abraham Accords, Saudi Arabia didn't. They said they would eventually, who knows when. You can clearly see the alignments there and how the Saudis have backed down and said, whoa, what the Israelis and the Americans are sending our way doesn't suit me. Not at all. That's been a factor. Because, like it or not, you have to go through their airspace. Although sure, the Americans can just ignore that and fly through without the Saudis' permission, and they don't care. And the Saudis aren't going to try to shoot down a plane, that's obvious. But it's still been a factor, because let's not forget that Saudi Arabia is a key global producer in OPEC and OPEC+. In other words, the Saudis can play with the price of oil. They can easily pull off an operation like the one they did about 6 or 7 years ago, more or less, when they drove prices way down. Way down, I don't remember if it was to $20-something a barrel or something like that, or even less. Why? Because their oil production costs, since it's very high-quality oil and right at the surface, meaning you just stomp on the ground and oil comes out, well, their costs weren't even $7 a barrel. So if they set it at 15, they're already making a profit. Or even at 13. That's something Saudi Arabia can do, and maybe a few others, but not many. Because with those prices, they can sink, for example, the fracking industry. The Americans were in trouble there. One of the reasons they did that was to mess with the Americans. But it also sinks anyone else, the Iranians, anyone. In other words, no one can afford those prices and still make a profit. So they can play with that. They can increase their capacity, or rather increase the amount of oil they put on the market, and they can also restrict it. And that makes them play with oil prices, which means they have quite a bit of room to maneuver, even against the American empire, though the empire is still the empire. What's happening? All of this is hurting them, and the last thing they want is a chaotic Iran turned into a patchwork of warlords. That would mean Arabs, with an Arab area, a majority Arab region within Iran, where they would also face problems. Why? Because the Saudis have Shiites in the north, Arab Shiites, and they could become more mobilized than desired in a situation of chaos in Iran and the region. That is, they don't want that. They want stability. And look, to what extent? Of course, well, that's one thing. And then what you were asking me, there are also two key elements there. First, that the soft coup, the color revolution, or whatever we want to call it, that the Israelis, the Americans, and the British had set up, fails. That is, it reaches a peak, but from that point on, the Iranians take a hard line and put an end to those groups. The Russians have been key, as they did this with a system called Topol, if I remember correctly, or something like that. It has nothing to do with intercontinental missiles. The thing is, the Russians, who already have experience in controlling, first blocking, and then using Starlink communications to their advantage in the war in Ukraine, brought equipment so the Iranians could do the same. And that's why we've seen the internet shut down, which meant they could no longer communicate online, neither through cell phones nor anything like that. And the use of this equipment to first block the signal used by all those Mossad groups, controlled by Mossad, the United States, and so on, to communicate among themselves. And what's even more important, if possible, is that by locating the leaders of these groups and the groups themselves, these systems, once they block the signals, can identify where they're coming from and where they're going. Which means they know where the Starlink device is, the Starlink phone, placed in such and such house, in such and such location, connecting to the network. This has been essential to dismantle all the jihadist groups, well, jihadist and all kinds, but they had put an incredible number of people in there, under the control of Mossad and company. And this has been key. The Russians provided this equipment because, well, the last thing they want is for Iran to spiral out of control, for that to turn into chaos. This has also been crucial. The failure of the uprising. If they saw that the uprising was already under control, then that made them back off. Because the plan was, We start an uprising. The uprising succeeds. It begins to fracture. Some small towns and such start being controlled by ethnic groups, and so on. For example, the Kurds who came from Iraqi Kurdistan, where dissident Kurdish groups are based. The Iranians went through there, where they have bases and all that. They went into Iran. But notice that the first ones to warn them about this and say, hey, they're crossing over, were the Turks. But we don't want an independent, autonomous Iranian Kurdistan. No, 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 no. And they were the first to say, hey, they're crossing over. Go to this spot on the border and you'll catch them there. So this has been key, all these things. And since the color revolution they had planned didn't work, this has set the Israelis and the Americans back.
Esto les ha echado para atrás a los israelíes y a los norteamericanos. Y luego un tercer factor, no tenían las.
And then a third factor, they didn't have the weapons to do what they had planned. That is, if it had succeeded or if it had already achieved some major success, they would have started bombing. But they've realized that since this has failed, they no longer have the operational capacity to carry out serious bombings. So what have we seen? We're seeing two things. First, that a few days ago they ordered an American aircraft carrier that was in the Pacific to head over there because they didn't have enough planes to carry out airstrikes. Two, from the Atlantic coast, I'm looking here to see if I can find it, they gave the order yesterday or the day before for another aircraft carrier to head to the Mediterranean. That is, there's a key point. Whenever you want to understand what's happening in the Middle East, in particular, if the Americans don't have at least 2 aircraft carriers in the region, they don't have the capacity to carry out large-scale bombings. At least 2. Just so you get the idea. In the most serious war the Americans fought in the region, which was the first Iraq War, the one in 1991, they deployed 4 aircraft carriers in the Persian Gulf, in the Mediterranean, in the Red Sea, and so on. 4. If they don't have 2, they don't have enough forces for bombing. No matter that they have a base in Diego Garcia, no matter how many bases they have in the region, the key base in the area is too far from Iran. So forget it. I mean, no matter how many destroyers they send with missiles, they need to have at least 2 aircraft carriers. And if they don't, well, as has happened now, they call them, yes, they call them, but it takes a week, 8 days. So I don't know where the one from the Pacific is, whether it's already passed through the Strait of Malacca or not. But the other one has just been mobilized, and it's going to take at least another week to get into position in the Mediterranean. This means we're not going to have anything, at least for another 2 weeks, for that very reason.
Between 6 and 7 days apparently are needed for the arrival. Minimum.
That's why. So, yeah, note it down like this. They arrive, settle in, and so on. Not this coming week, but the next one. If they're going to do something, it'll be starting in about 2 weeks. We'll see how things stand, because since he's got 14 fronts open, right now he's busy with the Greenland issue and a bunch of other things, but we'll see. Anyway, as a general rule, whenever you want to know if the Americans are going to carry out a major operation somewhere in the world, you have to look at where the American aircraft carriers are at that moment, the 11 they have.
Here's a question from Angel Tito. It's from a while ago. We already answered it. To a large extent, the 8 European countries threatened by Trump are strengthening their solidarity with Denmark in the face of blackmail. What options do they have to stop it? None.
None, zero.
I mean...
No, they crush us. I mean, we have to keep in mind that most of the weaponry Europeans have is American, so if they cut off our spare parts, the planes don't fly and the tanks don't move. In other words, what I'm saying is nothing. I mean, our chance of being able to confront the United States and win is, as Ezekiel says, 0. If we want, we can even use negative numbers, -10, -11, but anyway, none. We're absolutely dependent.
Somos absolutamente dependientes. Nada.
Fernando, donde los números aparecen al rojo vivo.
Nothing. Fernando, where the numbers are red hot indeed, here on our channel, on Amas, Writing Myths, where, in our latest broadcast, just the third one, we presented Germany's historical responsibility, both in the war in Ukraine and in the entire security breakdown in Eurasia, with an in-depth analysis based on an interview with Jeffrey Sachs and Glenn Deason. Super interesting. Remember to join us. This week, we still haven't decided what we're going to present there, but remember that's basically where we show what we can't show on this channel. So everyone's invited to join us. We're already over 1,000. How many people now? More than 1,200 members. Amazing in 15, yes, less than.
Spectacular support, and thank you very much. Because as I said, we've been at it since the beginning of January, if I'm not mistaken. That is, since January 1st. Barely a month, I mean.
Fernando, my dear, toward the end, let's keep it a bit light. We're going back to Europe. Back to Europe again. No, just kidding. Now take a look at these very, very charming images.
Yes.
Here with us is Africa 502.1, Senegal, champion of the Africa Cup. Well, Senegal, a great power. Congratulations. Now take a look at these images. Spa day. Japanese macaques enjoy the hot springs at the Shibokudani Monkey Park in Yamanouchi, Japan. Look at those macaques. How amazing, how brilliant they are in the hot springs. Spa day.
Between rolling around in the ice and getting into the hot spring, you tell me. Right now I'm serious, I'm sensitive to the cold. At this moment, I'd love to be a macaque like those, over there.
There's not much difference. Images of Japanese macaques immersing themselves in the park's hot springs.
This is quite a show, huh? In Japan, up north on the island of Hokkaido, I think it is.
While tourists enjoyed watching the primates and spending a day at the spa, the footage shows visitors taking pictures of the monkeys as they relax and bathe in the hot springs, with cliffs and snow-covered mountains in the background. The idea of heat and snow together is inconceivable to me. It doesn't make sense to anyone. But snow, simply, yes, a tourist around here remarks at some point.
This leads me to a reflection. Which of the two animals, humans or macaques, are more intelligent? Because we have some macaques having a blast in hot springs, and some idiotic humans going to watch them bathe. In other words, the macaques must be cracking up at the humans, who are out here freezing while the macaques relax in the hot springs, watching these fools shiver as they take pictures of them.
Do you remember the final scenes of Planet of the Apes, Fernando? That's where we're headed, huh? Toward nuclear chaos and a return to the state of apes.
Indeed. Well, let's see. There are already lots of macaques in Europe, huh? Macaques, baboons, chimpanzees, all kinds. Chimpanzees, orangutans, everything. Europe is full of primates. Yes, 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 all kinds of species.
This is the only place in Japan where you can see monkeys bathing in hot springs, says the staff at Kobashi Park. The park opened its doors in 1964 as a center offering close observation of wild Japanese macaques. Since then, it has attracted not only regular tourists, but also researchers and photographers from Japan and abroad who come to study the fascinating ecology of the Japanese macaques.
Can you imagine the opposite? Let's imagine that the ones bathing were humans in the hot springs. Do you think the macaques would stay there for long, watching us bathe? They wouldn't even pay attention to us, which is the smart thing to do. Go about their own business. So it turns out that macaques are smarter than humans. They're proving it right here. I'm sorry, but that's how it is. We have to feed them, happy as can be. Happy as can be. Yes, so very happy. Well, look, I just found it. I had it right here from today. The aircraft carrier George Bush, with its naval group, has departed for Europe from the base, I suppose it's Norfolk, in the Atlantic, in the United States. Check where the George Bush is right now.
Mira a ver por dónde anda, el George H.W. Bush.
Fernando, lo de Senegal.
Fernando, the thing about Senegal, because of the Africa Cup final that just ended a few minutes ago, Senegal's victory over Morocco, 1-0. Congratulations to the Senegalese. Well done.
Extraordinario triunfo y
Extraordinary victory. Morocco is also a tough team. I mean, it's not an easy win. And well, I guess right now Senegal must be celebrating all over Dakar and everywhere, over the moon, naturally.
Very little coverage of the Africa Cup in Europe, unfortunately, even though African players have had an excellent level for years now, as have African teams. But, well, for cultural, colonialist, Eurocentric, supremacist reasons, unfortunately, very little coverage.
It always makes me laugh, especially, for example, in countries like France. When the French national team plays, you think, let's see, 90% of them are Africans, both from North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. Whatever you win, whether a little or a lot, is thanks to them. Because when it comes to the French, who are, let's say, native white people, there are only about 4 on the team.
Me even less or less.
Come on, I'm saying 4 just to say something. But it's like, well, that's it. I mean, Mbappe, you know what I mean. He's got French roots, sure. But come on, since the time of Charlemagne. Exactly. No, but this shows European racism. When something suits us, then yes. When they're soccer players and France wins, then they're heroes. It doesn't matter if they're African. But when they're regular immigrants, no. Then we don't want them. This is the same old European double standard.
Contradictions. Luckily, now the European elites, the European ruling classes, are starring in this episode of unparalleled humiliation at the hands of Donald Trump. So to all of them, welcome to Trump's humiliation. I don't want Trump, and neither do you. But when Ursula von der Leyen, Karl Nehammer, Merz, Starmer, Macron, all of them, appear as subjects licking Trump's boots, it does bring a bit of satisfaction, given their historic Eurocentrism, colonialism, and imperialism. Well, now they're getting a taste of their own medicine.
Bueno, ahora un poquito de su propia medicina.
And because of this, aside from how much we're going to laugh, because this is going to be quite entertaining, it's the end of NATO. If the United States stays the same, just keeps buying, it's the practical end of NATO. A NATO country, actually the leading NATO country, the one that created NATO and contributes about 80% of its budget, is the one that decides, it's not Russia, it's not China, to invade or take over a region of another NATO country, which is Denmark. So that's it, it's over. Completely. So, well, it's something that would actually be quite good. In that sense, I could, in quotes, go along with it. Of course, we're going to waste the opportunity. I'm saying it in advance because with the leaders we have, it's impossible for us to achieve even a minimum level of autonomy. Between leadership and the fact that we have nothing, we have no army, no natural resources, we have nothing. Well, it's just that, look, Europe's irreverence and its fall into the most unfathomable abysses of history, this is irreversible. There's no turning back now. We'd better start accepting it, those of us here, because there's no turning back. Isn't that right? It's our turn now to be at the bottom in the global order and getting poorer and poorer and so on. And we have, well, these regions that are growing, right? We have Asia, we have Africa, but we're going downhill, and no one can stop it. No one. Merz, Macron, and von der Leyen are making sure of that too.
Estimado Fernando, un placer.
Dear Fernando, a pleasure as always. Tomorrow on Demolishing Myths, Juan Antonio Aguilar's show. On Tuesday, Fernando solo. And on Wednesday, us again with our Wednesday talks.
Silly joke, bad one. In short, I mean, let's not confuse Fernando solo with Fernando playing solitaire. That's something else entirely. Playing solitaire is a card game that, well...
Yes, well known. Well, on Tuesday you can join Fernando on his comedy show as a comedian.
Like a failed comedian.
Demolishers, thank you very much for joining us. Beatriz Pulido, thank you for moderating. Fernando, my dear, a hug. See you later.
Ciao.